I never expected my ex-boyfriend's wedding to feel like the final public measure of my life. When his new bride sneered at me and suggested I should disappear from his life for good, I made a choice that stopped the room cold. I told her calmly that I would close my $500 million account at his family's bank. The look on their faces was priceless, but that moment was only the overture. What followed was the slow, quiet composition of 20 years of hurt turning into something unexpectedly sweet. My name is Amelia Morris. I'm 52 years old. I write music for films, not the explosive, thunderous scores that open summer blockbusters. My work lives in quieter spaces, melodies that slip under a scene and stay with you long after the credits fade. The kind of music that doesn't demand attention, but rewards those who listen carefully. For most of my life, that was also how I lived. Quietly, carefully, patiently. 7 years ago, the world suddenly learned my name. But long before that, I was just a woman sitting in a small Brooklyn apartment with an upright piano that was slightly out of tune, and a man who believed my dream was a liability. I still remember the day David Bennett told me he was leaving. It was 2008, the year the markets were collapsing. Televisions everywhere were shouting about failing banks, falling stocks, and economic panic. The air itself seemed heavy with anxiety. People walked the streets like the ground beneath their feet might disappear. Inside my studio apartment, sunlight stretched across an unfinished sheet of music on the piano. I was working on a piece that refused to resolve itself. The melody kept circling the same unresolved chord. David stood in the doorway watching me play. His arms were folded. That should have been my first warning. When someone stands like that, the conversation has already happened in their mind. Amelia, he said, his voice steady in the way people use when they've rehearsed something difficult. I kept my fingers on the keys. Yes? He took a breath. Our life needs stability you can't give me. The words hung in the air between us. I turned slowly on the piano bench. What does that mean? David stepped further into the room, looking around the apartment as if the peeling paint and mismatched furniture were evidence in a case he was presenting. It means you're still chasing this dream, he said. He said the word dream the way someone might say illness, as if it were something unfortunate, something irresponsible. David worked in finance even back then. Numbers made sense to him. Profit and loss, assets and liabilities. Life, to David, was something you balanced like a ledger. And according to his math, I was the deficit. I'm not chasing anything, I told him quietly. I'm building something. You've been building it for 20 years? That's how art works. That's not how life works. The argument that followed was not loud. In some ways, that made it worse. We spoke carefully, almost politely, like two professionals negotiating the dissolution of a contract. But beneath every sentence was the truth neither of us wanted to say out loud. David believed security mattered more than passion, and I believed a life without passion wasn't security at all. Our daughter Emily was 9 years old at the time. She was in the next room coloring quietly at the kitchen table while we dismantled our future. David spoke about practical things: college funds, retirement, insurance. Emily deserves stability, he said finally. She deserves parents who love their lives, I replied. His silence told me he thought those two things were not the same. When he left, he didn't slam the door. David was never dramatic. He simply packed a suitcase and walked out of the apartment like a man leaving a meeting that had run too long. I sat at the piano for a long time after that. Then I finished the composition. The melody finally found its resolution. Life went on. It always does. David rose quickly inside Bennett Financial, the investment firm his family had built decades earlier. Within a few years, he had a corner office and a reputation for ruthless precision. He moved into a sprawling suburban house surrounded by trimmed hedges and identical neighbors. The kind of place where success looked carefully curated. I moved into a slightly smaller apartment in Brooklyn. The piano came with me. So did the music. I kept composing. I kept teaching students who paid more in enthusiasm than tuition. And I kept believing that someday the work would matter. Emily split her time between us. But as she grew older, something interesting happened. She began spending more evenings on the worn couch in my apartment than under the sparkling chandeliers in David's house. She liked the mess, the music, the constant hum of ideas. Sometimes she would sit beside me on the piano bench and watch the notes form on the page. You hear the whole thing in your head first? She once asked. Not the whole thing, I said. Just enough to know it exists. Then, 7 years ago, everything changed. A small independent film asked me to write the score. It was a quiet story about a struggling jazz musician in 1960s New Orleans. No explosions, no grand speeches, just longing, loss, hope. I poured everything I had into that music. Every heartbreak, every stubborn refusal to give up, every lonely night at the piano after David left. When the Academy Awards called my name that year, the room exploded into applause. For a moment, I couldn't move. Not because I was shocked, but because something inside me felt suddenly complete. The world shifted after that. Directors called. Studios called. Opportunities multiplied. The struggling composer people had quietly tolerated suddenly became the Oscar-winning Amelia Morris. Success didn't make me louder, but it gave me something far more powerful: freedom. I started a small production company. I invested carefully. I built a life that felt entirely my own. Still, out of habit, or maybe sentiment, I kept a financial account at Bennett Financial. It held a little over $500 million in investments and royalties, a quiet thread connecting my present life to my past. Which is why, when the wedding invitation arrived on my Manhattan coffee table one afternoon, I stared at it for a very long time. David Bennett and Victoria Grayson request the honor of your presence. Victoria Grayson, David's former college girlfriend. Now a powerful venture capitalist with a reputation for turning ambition into empires. The invitation shimmered under the afternoon light. Elegant, expensive, impersonal. I should have thrown it away. Instead, curiosity, or perhaps unfinished music, made me RSVP yes. The wedding was held on a rooftop garden in Manhattan. As the Uber climbed through evening traffic, the city outside glowed in the amber light. The skyline softened under sunset. I adjusted my dress and looked out the window. Somewhere between the bridges and the buildings, I felt the faintest tremor of anticipation. Not anger, not bitterness. Just the strange feeling that life was about to return to a theme it had introduced decades earlier. And this time, the melody would finally resolve. The rooftop garden sat above Manhattan like a floating stage. Everything about it felt curated to impress. Crystal chandeliers hung beneath transparent canopies, catching the last amber light of sunset. White orchids spilled over railings and tables like carefully arranged waterfalls. Waiters in black jackets moved through the crowd with silent efficiency, offering champagne to guests whose conversations revolved around hedge funds, venture capital, and political donors. The entire evening felt less like a wedding and more like an exhibition of success. Exactly the kind of world David had always believed in. I stepped out of the elevator and paused for a moment at the edge of the reception space. For a second, no one noticed me, which suited me perfectly. I preferred observing first. Emily spotted me before anyone else did. She appeared from between two groups of guests, her champagne-colored bridesmaid dress catching the light as she hurried over. "Mom?" The surprise in her voice was genuine. "You actually came!" I smiled. Wouldn't miss it. That wasn't entirely true. But there was something deeper behind the lie. Emily had grown into a young woman who looked increasingly like her father. The same sharp cheekbones, the same poised posture. But when she smiled, the corner of her mouth tilted slightly crooked in the exact way mine did. That small imperfection had always made me irrationally proud. "You look incredible," I told her. She rolled her eyes in a way that instantly made her look 9 years old again. "It's the dress. Victoria picked them." "Of course she did." Emily leaned closer. "You know she spent 3 months planning every detail of this wedding?" "That sounds like her." Emily hesitated. "There's something else." The tone in her voice shifted. The careful social confidence disappeared, replaced by something more vulnerable. "What is it?" I asked quietly. She glanced across the room before answering. "Victoria thinks I should apply for internships at investment firms next summer." "That doesn't sound unreasonable." "It does when she says music production is a hobby." The words landed softly but carried weight. I studied my daughter for a moment. "When did you start thinking about music production?" Emily's eyes flickered with excitement she was trying to hide. "After I spent time in your studio last winter." I nodded slowly. "That room tends to do that to people." She smiled faintly. "Victoria says creative careers are unstable." "Victoria built her life on stability," I said calmly. "That doesn't mean it's the only path." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but a voice interrupted from behind me. "Well, I'll be damned." I turned to see Jason Bennett approaching. David's younger brother had always been the outlier in the family. While the rest of them wore tailored suits and spoke in careful financial language, Jason looked like a man who had wandered into wealth rather than chased it. His handshake was warm. "Amelia," he said with genuine affection, "you look fantastic." "You clean up well too, Jason." He grinned. "Success suits you." There was something knowing in the way he said it. Jason had always been the only Bennett who kept track of my career. "You're the only person here who seems happy I came," I said. "That's not entirely true," he replied quietly. "Half the room is wondering if you're the Amelia Morris who changed film scoring. And the other half is wondering why David invited his ex." We both laughed softly. Jason leaned closer. "You should know something." "What?" "Victoria doesn't like surprises." I followed his gaze across the room. That was when I saw them. David and Victoria Grayson stood near the center of the reception like the focal point of a painting. Victoria was striking. Tall. Elegant. Her silver-white gown reflected the soft lighting and controlled flashes. Every movement she made seemed measured, intentional. David stood beside her in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, greeting guests with the confident ease of a man who believed the evening belonged entirely to him. For a moment, David's eyes met mine. Recognition flickered across his face. Something else followed it. Surprise. Then the practiced social smile returned. Victoria noticed his hesitation and turned to see what had caught his attention. Our eyes met briefly. Her expression shifted. Not hostility. Not exactly. More like calculation. David guided her toward me. Amelia, he said as they approached. He sounded almost polite. David. Victoria extended her hand. Victoria Grayson, she said smoothly. Amelia Morris. Her grip was firm. Assessing. Then David added, with the casual tone of someone introducing an old acquaintance at a conference. Amelia used to teach music. For a split second, the sentence hung in the air. Used to teach music. I said nothing. Before I could respond, Emily stepped forward. Mom won an Oscar, she said plainly. The surrounding guests went silent. Emily continued, her voice calm but proud. For The Score of Midnight in New Orleans. And she just signed a deal with Paramount for a historical drama. Victoria's eyebrows lifted. David's smile faltered. Just for a moment. Jason, standing behind me, coughed lightly to hide his amusement. Victoria recovered first. Well, she said carefully, that's impressive. But the tone suggested the information had disrupted something she believed to be true. David cleared his throat. Yes, well, Amelia's always been talented. The conversation drifted away after that. But the atmosphere had changed. Something invisible had shifted. Later, as the ceremony began and guests took their seats, I watched David and Victoria exchange vows beneath the glowing canopy of lights. The city skyline stretched behind them like a silent audience. Their words spoke of partnership, shared ambition, a future built on common goals. I listened quietly. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a strange thought surfaced. David and I had loved each other once, but we had always been listening to different music. And that difference was finally about to be heard by everyone in the room. The ceremony ended with applause that felt rehearsed. Not insincere, just polished, like everything else that evening. The Manhattan skyline behind the rooftop garden had shifted from amber sunset to deep blue twilight. The city lights glittered below us like scattered diamonds. Music drifted through hidden speakers while waiters moved gracefully between tables, refilling champagne glasses before they were empty. It was beautiful. And strangely hollow. I remained at the edge of the reception, exactly where observers tend to sit. Close enough to hear everything. Far enough that no one felt obligated to include me. Jason joined me again, balancing 2 glasses of champagne. One for you, he said. Dangerous, I replied. Only if you start telling the truth after the second glass. We clinked glasses. From across the room, David moved easily through the crowd, greeting investors, political consultants, and venture capital partners. Victoria stood beside him like a perfectly matched counterpart, smiling with the composed confidence of someone who understood the value of presentation. They were a formidable pair. Success wrapped in elegance. Jason leaned closer. You know something interesting? He whispered. What? Half the room now knows who you are. That sounds exhausting. Give it 10 minutes, he said. The other half will too. As if on cue, the band quieted and a microphone appeared near the dance floor. David stepped forward. The room gradually settled. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations softened to whispers. David adjusted the microphone and smiled. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began. His voice carried easily across the rooftop. I know weddings are supposed to be emotional moments, but I'll try to keep this short. Polite laughter rippled through the guests. I met Victoria many years ago, he continued, long before life had taught me some of its more important lessons. Victoria smiled beside him. David's tone took on the rhythm of someone delivering a carefully structured argument. I've learned that the choices we make in life define who we become, choosing stability over uncertainty, choosing clarity over chaos, choosing a future built on real foundations. Another wave of polite laughter. The speech continued, and slowly something inside it began to sharpen. Sometimes, David said, we have to recognize when a chapter of our lives isn't leading us where we need to go. His eyes moved briefly across the room. They landed on me, only for a second, but long enough. I made difficult decisions years ago, he said. Decisions that led me here tonight. Several guests nodded approvingly. The message was subtle, but not subtle enough. Jason muttered under his breath. Wow. I remained perfectly still. David raised his glass toward Victoria. to the choices that lead us to the right life. The guests applauded. The band resumed playing, but the damage had already been done. Jason turned toward me. You okay? I took a slow sip of champagne. Perfectly. Across the room, Emily approached our table. Her expression was tight. You heard that, right? She said. I did. She looked furious. He basically turned his wedding speech into a lecture about why leaving you was the smart decision. I shrugged slightly. People often mistake justification for truth. Emily shook her head. I swear Victoria encouraged that speech. Maybe, I said calmly. Before Emily could respond, David and Victoria began circulating again among the guests. Eventually, they reached our corner of the reception. David looked relaxed. Too relaxed. The kind of confidence that comes from believing you've already won. Amelia, he said. David. Victoria's smile was controlled. Enjoying the evening? It's a beautiful event, I replied. David glanced around the table. Jason. Emily. Then me. I think it might be best going forward, he said casually, if we simplify certain relationships. Emily frowned. What does that mean? David didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on me. It means, he continued smoothly, that it would probably be healthier if Amelia kept a little distance from the Bennett family. The nearby conversations faded. Several guests within earshot had clearly noticed the tension. Jason set his glass down slowly. Emily's voice sharpened. She's my mother. David ignored her. This isn't personal, he added. Just practical. Victoria watched silently. There it was. The erasure. 20 years of history reduced to a logistical inconvenience. The quiet man, or in this case, the quiet woman, has a choice in moments like that. Stay silent, or let the truth speak for itself. I waited until David finished. Then I set my champagne glass down and spoke in the same calm tone someone might use to discuss the weather. You know what's slightly uncomfortable, David? He frowned. What? Hearing a lecture about financial decisions. I paused. And while $500 million of my money is sitting in your family's bank. The world stopped. Literally. Conversations froze mid-sentence. A waiter halted in the middle of pouring champagne. Somewhere behind us, a fork clinked against a plate and then went silent. David blinked. Excuse me? I continued gently. The investment account at Bennett Financial. The one holding roughly $500 million in assets. Victoria's face lost color. Jason slowly leaned back in his chair, watching like someone observing a perfectly executed magic trick. David forced a laugh. I think there's been some misunderstanding. There hasn't, I said calmly. The quietness of my voice made it worse. I've been considering moving those funds for months, I added. Monday seems like a good time. For a moment, no one spoke. Then whispers began spreading through the nearby guests like ripples in water. 500 million. The number traveled quickly. David's confident posture cracked. Victoria stared at me, not with anger, with realization. Because power built on assumptions collapses quickly when one fact changes. David swallowed. Amelia, maybe we should discuss this privately. I gave a small, polite smile. That's probably wise. Around us, the rooftop garden had become very, very quiet. The silence around our table spread outward like a ripple in still water. At first, it was just the small circle of guests nearest us who heard what I'd said. Then the whispers began. 500 million. The number moved across the rooftop garden faster than the champagne. David stood perfectly still. For the first time in the 20 years I had known him, he looked genuinely unprepared. Victoria recovered faster. She had the instincts of someone who had spent her entire career navigating high-stakes rooms. Perhaps, she said smoothly, her voice quiet but firm, this conversation would be better somewhere private. Her hand lightly touched David's arm. Not affection. Control. David nodded quickly. Yes, Amelia. Could we step inside for a moment? Jason leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. Oh no, he said casually. Please don't stop on our account. Emily shot him a look. Jason. He raised his hands in surrender, but the grin didn't leave his face. Victoria turned toward me again. This way. She gestured toward a corridor that led back into the building beneath the rooftop garden. I followed her. David came behind us. The sounds of the reception faded as the door closed. Inside, the hallway was quiet and softly lit, the muffled music from outside barely audible. For a moment, none of us spoke. Victoria turned first. $500 million? She asked calmly. I nodded. Approximately. David ran a hand through his hair. That can't be right. It is. Why would you have that kind of money at Bennett Financial? He demanded. Because it's a good firm, I said simply. Victoria studied my face carefully. You never mentioned this before. No one asked. David stared at me as if trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. The Amelia I knew was teaching piano lessons in Brooklyn. That was a long time ago. He frowned. How long have you had that account? 7 years. Victoria's eyes sharpened. The Oscar. Yes. Understanding flickered across her expression. She turned slightly toward David. You didn't know? David looked almost embarrassed. No, he admitted. Victoria let out a slow breath. That explains a great deal. She faced me again. I've heard your music, she said quietly. The comment caught me slightly off guard. In films, she continued, several times. I remember thinking the composer had an unusual sense of restraint. A faint smile touched her lips. Now I know why. David looked between us. I don't understand, he said. Victoria ignored him. Instead, she asked the question that mattered. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? The hallway grew still again. I considered the answer carefully. Because it would have complicated the story. What story? David's. David stiffened. What's that supposed to mean? I met his eyes. For years, you told people you left me because I was chasing an unrealistic dream. That was the truth. It was your truth, I said gently. Victoria watched the exchange with interest. If people had known I became successful, I continued, that narrative would have stopped working. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no response ready. Victoria spoke instead. You're saying you allowed him to believe you failed? Yes. And you never corrected that impression? No. She studied me for several seconds. Then she laughed quietly, not mockingly, almost admiringly. That's remarkably strategic. It wasn't strategy, I said. It was peace. David shook his head. This is absurd. Why would you keep your money in our bank if you felt that way? I answered honestly. Habit, mostly. And now you're closing the account because of a conversation at a wedding? Not exactly. I leaned lightly against the wall. I've been considering moving those investments for a while. Tonight simply made the timing clearer. David looked genuinely alarmed now. You realize what that kind of withdrawal would do to the firm. Yes. You're doing this to embarrass me. I tilted my head slightly. David, you embarrassed yourself. The words landed softly but firmly. Victoria glanced between us. For a moment, the powerful venture capitalist mask slipped, and I saw something more human. Recognition. You know, she said slowly, there's something strange about this. What? David snapped. Victoria ignored him again. She kept looking at me. I remember a film from a few years ago, she said thoughtfully. A quiet one about a jazz musician in New Orleans. Midnight in New Orleans, I said. Yes. She nodded. I saw it on a flight to London. The score stayed with me longer than the film did. Her gaze softened slightly. I didn't realize I was listening to the woman standing in front of me. David stared at her. You like that movie? Victoria shrugged. It had depth. Then she looked back at me. I suppose success changes how people see you. Sometimes, I said. And sometimes, she replied, it reveals how wrong they were before. The hallway grew quiet again. Outside, the music shifted to something slower. Victoria exhaled and straightened her posture. Well, she said briskly, the professional composure returning, this has been enlightening. She turned toward the door, leading back to the reception. Whatever happens with the account is your decision. I nodded. It is. Before leaving, Victoria paused. There's one more thing, she added. What? Her voice softened slightly. I suspect Emily inherited more from you than anyone realized. I smiled faintly. I hope so. When we returned to the rooftop, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations resumed. But every pair of eyes that glanced in our direction carried the same question. And for the first time that night, David Bennett looked like the least powerful person in the room. The rooftop reception never quite recovered. Music continued. Champagne kept flowing. Guests returned to polite conversations about investments and politics. But something invisible had shifted. Every so often I noticed people glancing in my direction, whispering quietly before looking away. The number had traveled through the room the way dramatic news always does. 500 million. It wasn't just money. It was a revelation. David moved through its crowd more stiffly now. His confident ease had been replaced by careful smiles and shorter conversations. Victoria remained composed beside him, but her attention had sharpened. She watched the room the way someone studies a market after unexpected volatility. Emily eventually found me near the edge of the terrace. Mom, she said quietly. I turned. Her eyes were wide, still processing what had happened. Did you really just say that? Yes. She let out a soft laugh. That was unbelievable. It wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was very dramatic. We both smiled. Emily leaned against the railing beside me, looking out over the glowing Manhattan skyline. Dad looked like someone unplugged his brain. That's an image. He's never seen you like that before. I considered that. No, I said. He hasn't. For a moment, we stood in comfortable silence. Then Emily spoke again. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated. When did you become this? This? She gestured vaguely toward the reception behind us. Confident, calm, slightly terrifying. I laughed softly. That took a long time. Emily studied me carefully. I think I want that. What? That kind of life where you don't have to prove anything. You don't get that by avoiding hard things, I said gently. How do you get it? By building something that matters to you. Emily nodded slowly. Then she took a breath. There's something else. Go on. I've been thinking about deferring law school. The words came out quickly, like she'd been holding them inside for weeks. To do what? Music production. She looked at me cautiously, waiting for judgment. Instead, I smiled. You already knew my answer before you asked. She relaxed instantly. You think it's a good idea? I think it's your life. Emily laughed quietly. Victoria definitely doesn't think it's a good idea. Victoria believes in security. And you don't? I believe in purpose. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. I've always liked your studio more than Dad's house. That's because creativity is messy. And finance isn't? Finance hides its mess better. Emily grinned. Later that evening, when the reception began winding down, we left together. The taxi ride through Manhattan felt strangely peaceful. City lights streaked past the windows while the driver navigated the late-night traffic. Emily scrolled through something on her phone. What are you doing? I asked. Looking at music programs. That was fast. I've been looking for weeks. She hesitated. I just needed to hear you say it was okay. I reached over and squeezed her hand. It's more than okay. She smiled. 3 months passed. Winter settled over the city, covering the streets with thin layers of snow that melted into gray slush by midday. My studio remained warm and full of music. Emily began spending more time there. At first, she simply watched. Then she started experimenting with sound design software, building small pieces of music that carried hints of her own style. She had a natural ear, not identical to mine, but close enough to make me quietly proud. One evening, while we were reviewing one of her compositions, my phone rang. The number surprised me. Victoria Grayson. Emily raised an eyebrow. That's unexpected, I answered. Victoria. Her voice sounded composed as always. Amelia, I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. There was a brief pause. I'm calling about something unusual, she said. That sounds promising. She gave a small laugh. The firm is hosting an arts endowment dinner next month. And? We'd like you to deliver the keynote. I raised an eyebrow. That is unusual. The theme is unconventional paths. That sounds carefully chosen. It is. I considered the invitation for a moment. And David? I asked. Another pause. David and I are currently taking some time apart. Emily's head snapped up. Victoria continued calmly. The wedding revealed certain differences in perspective. I said nothing. Regardless, she added, the invitation stands. I glanced at Emily, who was watching me with wide curiosity. All right, I said finally. I'll do it. When I hung up, Emily immediately leaned forward. What was that about? Apparently your father's bank now wants me to give inspirational speeches. She burst out laughing. That's incredible. I shrugged lightly. Life is strange. Outside the studio windows, snow continued falling over the city. Inside, Emily turned back to her laptop and pressed play on the track she'd been working on. The melody was rough, unfinished, but underneath it was something unmistakable, a voice that belonged entirely to her. And for the first time in a long while, I realized that what had happened at the wedding wasn't the end of anything. It was simply the beginning of a different movement in the same long piece of music. The Arts Endowment dinner was held 6 weeks later, not on a rooftop garden, not under chandeliers, but inside the grand ballroom of a historic Manhattan theater that had been restored instead of redesigned. The ceiling was painted with faded constellations, and the stage lights glowed warm against deep red velvet curtains. It felt more like a place for stories than for transactions, which was appropriate, because that night wasn't about markets. It was about choices. Victoria met me at the entrance. She wore a dark green dress this time, less ceremonial than her wedding gown, but somehow more powerful. Thank you for coming, she said. You asked, and you said yes. She studied me for a moment before adding, I suppose that means you're not holding a grudge. I never was. Victoria nodded slowly. I've been thinking about what you said that night. Which part? That success changes how people see you. I smiled faintly. It usually does. And sometimes, she said quietly, it reveals how wrong we were before. For a brief moment, the polished investor vanished, replaced by someone thoughtful and reflective. Then the professional mask returned. You're on in 10 minutes, she said. Inside the ballroom, the audience was an unusual mix. Investors, artists, philanthropists, students, people who believed money and creativity could sometimes exist in the same conversation. Emily sat near the front of the room. She gave me an exaggerated thumbs up as I walked past. I stepped onto the stage. The lights were warm against my face. For a moment, the room was silent. I adjusted the microphone. My name is Amelia Morris, I began. I write music for films. A few people applauded politely. I've spent most of my life working with things that can't be measured easily. I paused. Emotion, memory, silence. The room leaned in. Years ago, someone I loved once told me that pursuing music was unrealistic. A few quiet murmurs moved through the audience. They believed stability mattered more than passion. I let the words settle. And maybe they were right, if stability is the only goal. The audience listened carefully now. But I discovered something interesting over time. I smiled slightly. Passion has a way of creating its own stability. A small ripple of laughter moved through the room. I didn't become successful quickly. I became successful slowly. And that turned out to be far more valuable. I spoke about patience, about building something quietly when no one is paying attention, about the courage required to follow a path that doesn't impress people immediately. When the speech ended, the applause was warm, not explosive, but genuine. Afterward, several donors approached me about supporting new arts programs. I signed a few checks that night, large ones. Emily found me near the stage afterward. "You were amazing," she said. "Flattery from family doesn't count." It wasn't flattery. She smiled. It was a little terrifying, too. That seems to be a theme lately. She laughed. My music program accepted me, by the way. I had a feeling. She hugged me tightly. For a moment, the entire noisy ballroom faded away. Later that evening, Victoria joined us. Emily excused herself politely to get dessert. Victoria watched her go. "She's talented," she said. "She's determined." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "I think she'll do well." There was a small pause. "I also wanted to tell you something," she added. "What's that?" "The firm expected you to withdraw your entire account." "And? You didn't." "No." Victoria studied me. "Why?" "Because the decision was never about revenge." "What was it about?" "Alignment." She waited. "I moved most of the funds into investments that match the life I've built." "And the rest?" "I left it where it was." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "That's generous." "It's practical." She nodded slowly. "I see." Over the next year, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Emily's music improved quickly. My production company expanded. Victoria occasionally sent updates about arts initiatives the firm had begun supporting. David and I rarely spoke. When we did, the conversations were brief and polite. Years later, I sometimes think back to that wedding. People assume the moment I mentioned the $500 million was revenge. But it wasn't. The real victory happened long before that night. It happened quietly, in a small Brooklyn apartment, at a piano, while the rest of the world assumed I had failed. Now, sometimes late at night, I sit at the piano and play the first piece I wrote after David left. It begins softly, almost mournful. Then the melody slowly opens into something brighter, hopeful, resilient. That piece has become a refrain in my life, a reminder that success doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a note that finally resolves after years of tension. I don't need people to admit they were wrong. I don't need applause. I have music. I have a daughter who believes in her own voice. And I have a life built entirely from the choices I made. If that looks like revenge to someone watching from the outside, then it's the gentlest revenge imaginable. More than anything, it's proof of something simple. When you stay true to yourself long enough, life eventually writes its own score.